Every year in the United States, there are 275,000 books published, including new editions and excluding most fanfic. Of those, nearly 100% go unreviewed by me specifically. I'm Clint Colclaser, and this is a review of Dark One Forgotten by Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells. It's a fictional podcast. No, it's not a real podcast that tells fictional stories. It's a podcast that doesn't exist. You can't find it for free on your favorite podcast app or website, if websites that don't have an app still exist. It's more like a book, but they don't sell it in bookstores either. No, this is an audio play, a very old form from early radio, but distributed as an audiobook instead of as amplitude-modulated radio waves, which is good because no one has the tools to turn those into anything useful anyway. It's an epistolary novel, like Dracula, except there are no vampires, and it's not a novel. Now that I mention it, there maybe is a vampire. Dark One Forgotten is Dracula, except for the parts about vampires in novels. Dark One Forgotten is kinda indescribable. Luckily, I'm supernaturally good at descriptions. It's presented as a series of podcasts, inspired by true crime podcasts like Serial. In fact, according to one of my sources, Brandon Sanderson himself, inspired by Serial specifically. Dark One Forgotten follows a college music student turned investigative journalist trying to solve a long-forgotten, the word from the title, clever, trying to solve a long-forgotten murder and documenting her progress through a series of podcasts. The murder is surrounded by strange, possibly even supernatural phenomena. It's definitely supernatural phenomena. This is Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells, after all. I liked this story from the start, and by chapter 6 I was completely hooked. I mean, I could stop anytime I wanted, I just didn't want to. The mystery and action are captivating. It's a true crime story that isn't bound by the mundane constraints of reality. Anytime a true crime story would be forced to zig by boring truth, Dark One can zag, and zagging has always been more interesting. While the idea to zag came from Brandon Sanderson, he knew he couldn't write it himself. A story framed as a podcast was going to be exclusively dialogue, and ChatGTP couldn't write it well enough for his liking. So, Sanderson went with his second choice, Dan Wells. Anyone who's still wondering why a story by Dan Wells and Brandon Sanderson should definitely contain supernatural phenomena needs to know more about them. And since one of them has his name written on the cover art much larger, I'll start with the smaller name and build up. Dan Wells is a great author, mostly known for horror and suspense. Maybe that's why Brandon Sanderson chose him? No, it's probably the ChatGTP thing. His John Cleaver series is fantastic. If you pick up Dark One Forgotten and want more from him in the supernatural suspense genre, pick it up. The first book is suspiciously named I Am Not a Serial Killer. There's even a movie with Christopher Lloyd. The movie has a disappointingly low number of DeLorean scenes, but is otherwise good. Brandon Sanderson has made a name for himself by finishing Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. He has also written a few stories and books by himself: The Stormlight Archive, Mistborn Era 1, Mistborn Era 2, Elantris, Warbreaker, White Sand, Alcatraz vs. the Evil Librarians, The Reckoners, Legion, Cytoverse, The Rhythmatists. 4 secret novels he wrote in his spare time, which apparently he spends writing as an escape from his day job of also writing. He's written a large number of novellas, short stories, and a video game. A thank you to the 17th Shard and the Copper Mine for helping me put together that list. He's probably written at least one more book while you're watching this. And to give him extra time to do that, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Nordic Skills Fresh. Build your army, fight demons, and keep your internet traffic safe. Defeat the Dark Lord by leveling up with one of thousands of courses by professionals and celebrities alike. Ingredients delivered fresh to your door daily. Nordic Skills Fresh. Dark One Forgotten is a well-written and expertly acted audio play, with a full cast, music, and sound effects. At only 6.5 hours long, including the credits, Dark One Forgotten is easy to finish in a day or two. I listened at 1.5 speed. It was fast without compromising the voice acting too much. You'll need to increase the speed further if you prefer everything to be read by a caffeinated Mickey Mouse. To those of you who only listen to audiobooks by monthly subscription and are looking for something a little longer to spend your precious tokens on, remember I am not a serial killer. Let's get into spoilers. I can finally stop dancing around the issue. Dracula doesn't show up. And, according to episode 89 of Intentionally Blank, there's a joke in here about MLMs that Dan Wells is very proud of. The action starts off with our protagonist, who does have a name, but I don't want to spoil everything, discovering a forgotten, hey, there's that word again, young music prodigy. It turns out that this prodigy, with a bright future in classical music, or perhaps a career as a dancing violinist, an entirely fictional position Dan made up for this book, radio play, disappeared entirely nearly 3 decades earlier. Things get weirder when the protagonist, let's call her Christina to make things easy. Christina discovers that the murdered prodigy, I'll call her Leona, was forgotten by everyone, including the police who took the missing persons report and her own mother. The story makes it very clear that we aren't supposed to chalk this up to common neglect on either count. Christina documents her investigation into this missing person through a series of podcasts with her friend and the people they interview along the way, a string of people all suffering from acute Leona amnesia. I haven't heard another story presented this way. I have heard of murder mysteries, and I've heard of podcasts. I've obviously heard of radio plays, but a murder mystery radio play pretending to be a podcast? Come on. Dark One Forgotten is unique. It creates a deep sense of immersion, like VR if it worked properly, particularly for the intense action and horror scenes, like VR if it all went terribly wrong. If you're familiar with Dan and Brandon's other work, then you know they excel at those scenes. Action and horror, not VR. And they brought that skill to bear here in full force, like what Mark Zuckerberg wishes he could do for VR. Have you guys tried out VR? A team of voice actors brings the story to life in a way only audio can. They should also consider bringing a story to life in a way only mimes can, to be inclusive of those who are hard of hearing. I listen to a lot of audiobooks and watch almost no mimes, and this audiobook is in a class of its own. Traditional audiobooks try to replicate the experience of reading it yourself. Reading's a very old tradition and no one has time for it anymore. They typically let the words guide your feelings instead of the acting. Dark One Forgotten is different. It has a soundtrack to guide the mood, sound effects when you need them, and the actors take liberties to make the lines their own. I actually love Dark One Forgotten, and I think a lot of you will too. The only thing I'd like to see improved is how it's purchased. I'd love to not purchase it. I think the story would work even better if it were released as an actual podcast. Now obviously artists can't survive by giving away all their work for free, and I definitely don't want my stories filled up with ads, with the exception of ads for mobile VPN daily meal delivery games. But it would be more immersive in this case. As it stands, it took me several chapters to get into it as a podcast, because I bought it and played it through an audiobook app, one guess as to which one, and that put my ears into that mode. If I could have searched in my favorite podcast app, I think I would have gotten into the format much faster. And yes, the One Guess app can do both, but I don't use it that way. The first true collaboration from Brandon Sanderson and Dan Wells was great, and I hope they have even more for us. They do. Oh yeah, and there's also more Dark One content. There's at least one graphic novel with more planned, so if you're intrigued by the world of Dark One Forgotten and want to dive deeper into the fantastical element, you should pick up a copy. Remember, I am not a serial killer.